Hello, everyone. So our first high-level interview today is with Mr. Bjorn Kummel, who is chair of the WHO Working Group on Sustainable Financing. And of course, outside that, he leads the Unit on Global Health Affairs at the German Federal Ministry of Health. Bjorn, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and honor, obviously.
Yes, and of course, I'm happy to just be speaking with you in person. Of course, this is the first in-person event after 2.5 years. Can you just describe how the atmosphere at the World Health Assembly? And you speaking with health ministers, speaking with your colleagues in person.
Okay, obviously with my colleagues in person, to some extent it's even true, even for our delegation, that some of them haven't seen each other for 2 years. But the same obviously is true for everybody at the Assembly. So, I mean, it's a big global health community. This is a special World Health Assembly because I think normally it's even more attended by lots of civil society groups, and because the Palais des Nations is being renovated, there's limited access at this time, and obviously it's still COVID, so there are smaller delegations, but we are seeing each other in person, I think since 2.5 years the first time. In my working group we had already one meeting in person, but that was also limited to one delegate per delegation. So no, it's really something else, and I think it also adds to the beauty of multilateralism, to meet in person. I think it makes things easier. It's also something in order to reach a compromise, it's important to meet people in the room and more or less feel the expectation on the sides of everyone. And I think also in my working group, I mean, we've reached a consensus, and I'm not really sure whether we would have reached the same consensus if we had done this purely virtual. So I think it adds to building compromise and understanding and trust, the possibility to meet again. So I think the whole pandemic has been challenging, obviously, for all of us, but also has been a challenge to multilateralism.
Agree. But you know, you've become somewhat of a superstar now because of the whole discussion WHO financing. After 18 months, the working group has reached a consensus on the recommendations. But for the benefit of our audience, especially those who are watching online, can you just tell us with these recommendations, what's the expectation for member states and what's the expectation for the World Health Organization? Okay,
so the working group has reached a compromise. So practically, we've been discussing now for 1.5 years. We had already reached more or less a broad compromise on almost all issues, but one remaining part, which was the most controversial one, was an increase in the membership fee, the assessed contributions. So practically what all member states have to invest in WHO, that remained controversial among the members of the working group, which are all 194 member states, and we reached a consensus by the end of April, so practically a month ago. So what does the consensus say? We are highlighting that we agreed upon an aspiration to reach 50% of the currently approved program budget to be financed through 50% assessed contributions by 2030, 2031, but potentially even one biennium earlier. Obviously, linked to this substantive increase in assessed contributions, we have discussed that governance reforms need to happen in parallel, and I think there will be a role, obviously, of a task room that will be established following the Assembly to follow up on these reforms and to indicate what we really expect from the Secretariat to do. Plus, we also agreed that the Secretariat will produce a next proposal for the program budget to be submitted to the next World Health Assembly and indicating an increase of 20% in assessed contributions. So obviously lots of different figures, but in the end, in 6 to 8 years, all 194 member states together will contribute roughly 1.2 billion in addition to what they currently contribute as their membership fee, which is a little bit less than 1 billion in 2 years. Mm-hmm. So overall, the assessments from member states will grow to the level of 2.2 billion over 2 years.
So just for our audience, currently the assessed contributions are over 956 million.
Exactly,
right?
Yes.
And that will grow in 8 years' time to over 2.112 billion. Yes. And that's going to be half of the current base budget of WHO, which is over $4.3 billion. But by the time we reach the 8th year, it's possible that it's no longer 50% of the base budget. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's not only not possible. It's not only possible. It will be. I mean, it's de facto. It will be less than 50%. So practically, we have to some extent moved away from the expectations or the recommendations from the IPPPR, the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. Their proposal was that 66% of the program budget, of the core mandate of the program budget, the base segment, should be financed through assessed contributions, no matter how large the base segment or the core mandate of WHO should be. And that was over ambitious for member states. And there, I think we wouldn't have reached a compromise on that. We are going for 50% of the already approved program budget now. So indeed, if the budget grows further, it will be less than 50%. And most likely, by the time we reach it, maybe 40%. But that's much more than otherwise. If we hadn't agreed upon any increase, we would potentially, the percentage of the assessed contributions would be further shrinking.
Are member states already aware how much they're going to be contributing?
Yes, and they have been aware the entire time, because the working group, I mean, the Bureau as well as the Secretariat has produced all the figures in absolute terms, so every member state knows exactly the figure that they will have to contribute if, obviously, we are living up to this aspiration.
Mm-hmm. You're talking, there was a lot of talk about, expecting also of WHO reforms, improvements on efficiencies, transparency, effectiveness. Can you talk a little about that? What exactly are member states expecting from WHO with these increases?
So from the very start, it was clear that any major increase in assessed contributions would have to be linked to governance reforms and further reforms. I think there's this overall notion that member states expect, obviously, an even stronger WHO and a more agile WHO. And I think what we learned throughout the entire process is that the way we are financing the WHO currently is actually an obstacle for being agile and effective, even accountable and transparent. So they are certainly interlinked. There was, at some stage, a debate: would member states first need to have further reforms on transparency, efficiency, accountability, and governance? And would we have to wait for the AC increase practically, or would we have to wait for this to happen and then member states would be willing to agree? And I think we clarified in the working group that both are interlinked. So, and we learned that from the independent panels and experts. So practically, the one key tool to increase efficiencies is the way we are financing. The current way of financing of WHO, I refer to, or I often mentioned it as being completely rotten, or the member states, I think, have agreed to articulate the status quo is unacceptable, but it certainly adds to inefficiencies. The WHO has to manage over 3,000 awards, people who are, well, hired because they are the top class experts for, I don't know, dealing with pandemics or with mental health, NCDs, etc. To a large extent, they have to spend their time raising funds, reporting back, because they are receiving short-term funding, lots of different funds. So the independent experts clarified that this is completely inefficient. It doesn't make much sense. But obviously, in addition to this, there are further reforms to be expected. One key aspect that we discussed lengthily and where I think we will see further debates is the priority setting. WHO, and it's not the Secretariat, I think it refers to a large extent to us member states, we have to do a better job in setting priorities. Currently, whatever is in the program budget, the overall budget amount, we are not differentiating in what is more a priority than the other thing. And I think that needs to happen, and I think there's a clear expectation from member states that they want this to happen. With regards to the further discussions, often member states refer to, we want to see more transparency, accountability, and efficiency. And then I said, yes, we can do it. But it's not the chair of the working group answering what that exactly means to member states. So I was asking, so what do we exactly mean by that? And often member states then had challenges in articulating that. I think we will see, obviously, it's a huge organization, and there are potentials for efficiency savings, obviously. And there certainly we have to work further on accountability, as in many of the other organizations, and transparency. Potentially with regards to transparency, I would say, especially in budgetary terms. And there was this overall notion that the WHO is already, providing gold standard. There's the budget portal you can find and you can track which donor provides which funding and how it's been spent, I guess much better than in many of the other organizations. There are further things like the investment case, which was something that member states expected, but the WHO Secretariat is delivering already. Another thing was member states wanted and still want to know exactly how the funding would be used. And there was a clear indication of how the additional assessed contributions would be used. And in particular, in order to provide global public goods, which are currently underfunded, which certainly is a huge risk to WHO's integrity and independence. Global public goods norms, we expect that to be paid through the membership fee. Another key aspect is obviously WHO's work in the countries. There we are lacking the flexible long-term resources in order to really enable WHO to play its leading role in the country setting. Another key aspect I would say is the polio transition. As you know, especially in the African and Emerald region, much of what WHO does depends on currently still the polio funding. That will diminish once polio is eradicated, because then most likely the polio donors will not be providing this funding anymore. And with that, I think there's a huge risk of losing these polio assets, we call them. So surveillance structures that have been essential in order to, also fight other diseases.
We know that every step of the way, the World Health Assembly is this decision-making body. So is it possible that, by 2024, is it possible that member states would say, we can't have this increase at this moment?
I think that's always possible. In the end, we can decide in one World Health Assembly the one thing, and the next time we decide something else. So practically the World Health Assembly remains its own, it never gives up its own sovereignty. So obviously we can come back and decide upon something completely different. So the final say is normally the adoption and or approval of the appropriation resolution. That's practically the resolution that clarifies how much assessed contributions each member state pays for the next biennium, and that is still to come. Is that likely? No, I doubt that. If there is a full consensus in the working group, we have reached a full consensus in the working group. We have already had a lengthy debate in the Program and Budget and Administration Committee with all member states participating, taking the floor and approving the recommendations. And with the Assembly, once the Assembly does the same, certainly it would be a devastating signal for any member state to move away from that aspiration.
Mm-hmm. What are the other big ticket items that you're watching out for at this Assembly? We're midway through it. What are the other things that our audience should also be watching out?
So I think there are some key ones, obviously. I mean, apart from strengthening WHO also through the finances, there is, which is to me also one key lesson to be learned from this pandemic. That was one of the key outcomes of the independent panels. I think obviously this is the first time that we come together in person again, addressing obviously also what do we learn from this pandemic in pandemic preparedness and response. So there is a discussion about taking forward and strengthening the IHR, and we will see how this moves on. And overall, there is, it's not really on the table, but member states obviously are discussing the broader aspects of pandemic preparedness and response. So I think that's certainly, in the frame of the overall assembly. I think we shouldn't forget that the World Health Assembly is not just about pandemic preparedness and response, but there are lots of things that I guess the world to some extent neglected over the past 2 to 3 years. So be it the immunization agenda, be it HIV, tuberculosis, meningitis is on the agenda, NTDs. So there is lots on the agenda, and I think it's good to debate that again in person. Certainly another thing, highlight, I guess, every 5 years is the DG election. So the DG's renomination is one of the key points. And I guess, I mean, we are meeting here in Central Europe, then there is also a geopolitical crisis that is certainly on the agenda.
Are there any particular reforms, broader reforms, that we can expect, that member states are expecting from WHO, maybe even outside of the financing discussions?
Well, I think in the pandemic preparedness and response arena, there are reforms. There is the proposal to have a new subcommittee of the board on pandemic preparedness and response. What is not on the agenda, and I think we need to clarify that because there are lots of notions out there, is the pandemic treaty or pandemic instrument. It's not on the agenda. Why it's not on the agenda? Because there's a specific process which will last another 2 years, and then we will see whether there's an agreement to be reached. I think there's lots of notion out there that the World Health Assembly would be debating that. That's certainly not the case. So I think those are the key ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were mentioning yesterday that, with a lot of support for the financing aspect, your work as chair of the working group will soon end. What's next for Bjorn Kummel?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think that's an unexpected question. No, I don't know. Obviously, I have my normal job to do. Those have been 1.5 years, quite interesting, stressful times. I also enjoyed them. So it was positive stress to a large extent. It was, and I think you said superstar or superhero, something like that. The hero here, or the star, was the team. Yeah, it was not just me. I guess to some extent I gave the process a face. Yeah, but there were lots of people supporting this. I had a great bureau, but often we are forgetting all the member states who've been pushing and who've been really pushing and supporting an ambitious outcome, but also the Secretariat and civil society. Civil society, I think, was key in various constituencies to push for, not to let go. Yeah? At some stages of this process, it was unclear whether we would get somewhere. It was interesting because while it was potentially tough to reach a compromise or a final outcome of the working group in the member state setting, if you ask anyone else, apart from member states, there was a clear consensus from the start that there needs to be a substantive AC increase. So that was, I think, helpful. What I'm going to do, fly back to Berlin and do my normal day-to-day job. I think there's lots on the agenda still in global health, also apart from pandemic preparedness and response. There is, and I guess much of that obviously is linked to the WHO.
Well, thank you so much, Bjorn, for all of these insights, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Please stay tuned because we have a lot more important discussions happening today.